Hello and welcome to New York Empire Podcast presented by Greatest Ultimate Bag. I'm Dan Hilton and he's Matt Pippin, Auletta. And boy, oh boy, do we have some Ultimate to talk about today. Yes, we are going to talk all about the East Division standings after Boston's 2-0 weekend. So I think we're going to dabble a little bit in that Boston-DC game as well, including, but of course, the highlight being the 16-14 win over the New York Empire in the Empire's first home loss since 2018. But first, we're going to start with some good news because even in a loss to Boston, there was some pretty joyous good news, things that you and I have been waiting for a long time for. And for those who were there in 2013, who saw the 42 blocks from Mike Drost, the Empire's OG, the last remaining Empire player from the inaugural season. So if you do the math, that was 11 years ago. So I mean, yeah, he's been doing it a while. He hit 200 blocks, that being Mike Drost. So congratulations to Mike Drost, joining brother Ryan as the only two players in league history with 200 blocks.
I like that he celebrated a little bit. It also came at a huge point in the game. I mean, that was crunch time. I'm glad it wasn't just like a garbage dink something down that wasn't really going to be caught, or just like, end of quarter kind of situation that didn't matter in a whatever. No, that was big time. You could tell he was super excited about it. He gave like a no good, like I got this kind of thing, and they were fired up for a minute. So I thought it was going to propel them to victory. So it was going to be like extra, but it didn't end up turning out that way. But yeah, I played in the league for maybe 6 years. I had 27 blocks maybe. So 200 is absolutely wild to me. So congrats. Just can't believe it. And all congratulations, Michael.
Yeah, I didn't mean to neuter his accomplishment because 42 in that.
Oh, I didn't think you did. No.
Yeah. 42 in the first year was it's where the league was at the time. But I will say 2017 when he played O-line, he also got a bunch of Ds on the O-line that year, almost making up from the karma that he had in the 42. And then the last two seasons basically playing lesser points than we'll say the D1 or the regular D1 starters, and still having to pick up the blocks he did. Also, he plays a much different way than he used to play back in the day too, where back in the day, a lot of it was unders, a lot of it was coming through it, a lot of athletic plays. I mean, him and Ryan are very different, but he still was able to make all those plays then. And not to say he's any less of an athlete now, 11 years later, but his blocks come in a little different way. And I was really excited how it happened too. Like, again, up in the booth, I'm also always thinking of what is the staying power of this moment. And it was so good that it was a huck because I got to set up the call. I saw it go up early. Auletta also was to my left, and I listened back in the highlight, and thankfully you couldn't hear her because she did scream time for 200 or something to that effect, where I didn't know it was his mic, but if not, Ellie let me know. But so I got to set up the call. I saw him get positioning on Carapella, and even though Carapella went up first way early and out-jumped him, the savvy vet had the positioning, and I just felt like it was a really good way to get 200. And to your point, it was at that point 14-13, and the Empire wound up not scoring that. They wound up giving it back, I believe, and then there was a timeout, and then Boston wound up getting it. But anyway, that was 14-13, could have tied it up 14-all. So yes, that was a huge moment in the game, and a big congratulations for Mike Drost. So it does feel like a sense of relief, at least for the season, and all those boxes you have to check. And certainly Mike getting 200 was very much near the top of my list this season in terms of individual accomplishments for Empire players.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I think they'll come a little easier now too when he's not as in his head about it. I think we'll see them trickle in at a slightly more steady rate. That'd be my guess. If I didn't have two children and I had more time on my hands, I had considered looking back at the 2017 stats and seeing just how many times I threw it away and Michael got the block so that I could say I directly helped him get to those numbers. But yeah, maybe somebody else. If anybody is listening and so inclined, maybe I'll have the team send you a free hat or something. That'd be sweet.
Yeah, so, I don't know how many actual human hours it would take to go through that, but that's one of those that I think about those things before games. I'm doing my prep, and there are sometimes I have those ideas, and I go, absolutely not. I'm not.
Yeah,
I don't have the time and the resources for that. Okay, but back to the matter at hand. The big win for Boston, and of course, this is going to sound Empire apologetic from me, but I think as evidenced by their win over DC on Sunday as well, I think the win over the Empire for Boston says much more about Boston as a championship contender than it does about New York not being a championship contender, even at this point in the season. I think we learned this weekend that the winner of the East Division has as much of a chance to win the title as any other division. It felt like the South was the best division. It felt like Salt Lake was the best team in the league, which they still might be. But I think the East Division champion could go in and win championship weekend. And I think Boston's 2 wins over New York and DC actually confirmed that.
Yeah, I just made like a very quick little list of like teams that realistically probably have a shot at winning a title right now. And, there's a little gray area towards the bottom, but just, it's a great time to be a fan of the league and this division in particular, because Boston, DC, and New York are all that level. I could see any of those teams winning a championship. It's not just a foregone conclusion that the Eagle Empire is going to roll through the East and potentially roll through to a finals appearance again. So I have Boston, DC, New York, Salt Lake, Carolina, Austin, Atlanta, Minnesota, Chicago, all as like not crazy shots to potentially win a title. And then, not to discredit, Seattle has a pretty good record so far. I don't necessarily think when it comes to crunch time that they will advance through the playoffs out there, or, they've had a slightly easy schedule, but I mean, they are winning against the teams they need to beat to make the playoffs. And then Colorado has only really played 3 games this season, and, they unfortunately ran into some pretty good teams. Atlanta got the best of them. So, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them also, the puncher shot at getting out of that division, making championship weekend. So, yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be a fan of the league. I watched some games, I watched some clips. A lot of good Ultimate out there this year.
Yeah. So just to focus on Boston for a second, and again, the 2-0, we were, of course, coming in, the narrative about the league and all that stuff was about Jeff Babbitt. So this conversation, I think, needs to begin with Jeff Babbitt fairly. And having watched that game, close up from the booth, I think the 2024 MVP of this league, which also happens to be the 2023 MVP of this league, is still Jeff Babbitt. I think, especially talking about after the game, and you and I were going over this right before we hit the air, I say heck with that revenge narrative. I think it's a bunch of hogwash at this point. I don't think it's a thing. I mean, yes, there were emotions. Again, I gave him a big hug after the game, and always a great guy to talk to, but they are professionals, and especially seeing him win the championship last year with the Empire, winning that championship at the end of the season is his goal. It is what he's trying to do for Boston. And it's why all those players, that's why they go to practice. It's why they play the games. It's why they do the workouts. It's why in the car rides, all those little moments in between, it's not just about, oh, this is a team that I left and now it's time to beat them. But the reason why I think he's the MVP of the league, and you see in that game that you'll expand upon this, that it was not some kind of special, as you call him, Jeffrey, like Jeffrey put the team on your back game. That's not what it was. But I think he raises a team's level, and calm goes a long way. And I think he raises the calm poise of a team more than any other player in the entire league. I think in years past, Max Shepard may have had an argument, but Pittsburgh actually just went out, funny enough, over the weekend and put on the second cleanest offensive game in league history in a big win over Indy. The first cleanest was the Empire against the Breeze in the playoffs last season, by the way. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily a big, huge marquee Jeff Babbitt game. He put up the numbers, of course, as one would expect him to do, where he had the 3 goals, the 2 blocks, the 3 goals, the 2 assists, the 1 block, a +6, just 158 total yards though for him. Yeah, he didn't commit a single turnover, one hat trick assist. So not necessarily outrageous numbers against New York, but you just see the way that their offense functions with him in it. That this is not a team that, even in Boston, they lost because they got a little rattled. And then look how much better Nathaniel Dick was. And I think, if anything, this shows you that Jeff Babbitt is Jeff Babbitt. He raises your ceiling. And if other players like Nathaniel Dick, who's a captain on the team, who wasn't great against the Empire up in Boston, that if they can all raise their level, then that's what makes Boston a championship team, because he just raises the level of everybody around him without necessarily needing to take over every minute and every point and get all the highlights and all that stuff.
Yeah. Quick props to Orion Cable and Tanner Johnson-Go. They are also very big bodies making massive impacts. And so that when you have that with Jeff on the field, it's a lot to deal with. It was similar to, Jeff with Lithio and some other big bodies. Jeff, it's funny, you say he's calming, and that is very true. He's like a very steady reset. He's almost never going to turn the disc over because he doesn't necessarily take many risky throws. And when he does, they're risky in still like a very safe way. Like sometimes he'll drop like a kind of like a bladey whatever when he needs to, but in general, the throw might look a little more fun, a little more daring, but there tends to be no one around to do those. Like he picks his spots really well. So calming, yes, but one of the things that I think the Empire are missing, obviously, besides his amazing field presence and play, they are missing somebody just like flexing on people at the corner cone. And I say that a little tongue in cheek, but like there is an energy he also brings, and like this aura of I'm unstoppable, therefore we are unstoppable. And the team, New York, does not have that right now. I mean, occasionally they had Yacht, blowing kisses, playing the villain, being a little silly. This weekend he was riding a little motorcycle, I guess, which was kind of funny.
That was for actually. So
Scored
that shout out to his
scored some
grandfather.
goals.
That was for his grandfather. So that was actually a as his wife Anna told me before the game, that was already prepared. So he talked to Grandpa.
Yeah.
Grandpa said, "Hey, you're always blowing kisses to Anna. Where's my celebration?" So that's what that was. That's a good point. Yacht also did show up statistically. 6 goals, 2 assists, 1 block, led everybody on the field with a +7. Like Yacht was up to the moment, had a superstar performance. But to your point, yeah, it didn't feel like Yacht was taking over the game, even though the numbers were there.
Which leads me to the rest of the Empire team. I thought in general, so they lost, obviously. Everybody who's listening probably knows that. But the game was really close. Like, I don't think they necessarily played that poorly. The game was close. It was 2 very good teams. Somebody had to lose. I'm not smashing the panic button if I'm an Empire fan or player or the coaches. There's stuff to work on for sure, but they're fine. But what they need somebody to kind of take over. And, I guess I have 2 points to kind of smush together here. One, the team looked great when Ethan Fortin took over in that other game. He was just like a ping pong ball all over the place. He brought this energy and this passion and this like fire to that. And that, they needed it strategically to move around and do well, but they also just kind of needed somebody who was like, I got this today. Don't worry about it. And they don't have that often. So, like a lot of the times the last few years, everybody says Jack Williams is the best player in the world. He ends up on all these lists, and when people vote or they do like mock drafts, like Jack Williams is like, he goes at the top or next to the top or whatever. And I've played with Jack. I've watched Jack, both, club, league, whatever. Like he is amazing. He's in the top, 5 to 10% of most skills: running, jumping, throwing, field sense, defense, whatever. But he's like, to me, watching sometimes, he's like bottom 25% of like passion or like, I got this. Like sometimes I think the best player in the world needs to just show up and tell everybody, I'm the best player in the world, according to everybody. Like, I got this. We are fine. Let's go out. I'm going to ball out. I'm going to do all these great things. Like, if you look at the Jack Williams heat map from this game, it's a bunch of little passes side to side. It's just, it couldn't be more boring. And sometimes that's what they need. But right now, that is not what this iteration of the team needs. They need somebody who is going to score goals, make big deep cuts, like blow some people up, just like, put people on posters, whatever. They need some dynamic attitude. They need something else out there. And if, Yacht can only do so much, it needs to come from some other places. And I would look at, quote unquote, the best player in the world for that.
Well, one of the times they did go deep to Jack, it was in double coverage, and Boston got the D on that one, that it was getting thrown into 2. And I'll kind of take the opposite approach to that, not in a disagreement, but in that I think Boston did a fantastic job. Again, I compliment Boston on this. They did a great job switching in the middle of that field. And in the first half, our Empire MVP, which is, again, not tongue-in-cheek, Charles Weinberg, was good in that first half. He was finding space. He had that huck in the first point of the game, set the tempo early, and Charles was fantastic. And I thought they did a great job, that being the Empire, in the first half, kind of targeting the rookie in Jonas Stang Osborne, which, again, there's no weaknesses on Boston's defense. But the first 2 points of the game, it was the Empire. If you're going to switch, then the Empire were looking to target that matchup. Again, very much a basketball principle, and I'll bring up these 2 things about basketball here, where it's very much a basketball principle where in big games, good teams know how to target matchups, and that's what they did. They got Stang Osborne to be the deepest man on Yacht, and then they took him deep. And Charles saw it, set it up early, because, again, he's also a club teammate. So they're familiar in the Boston area. They know each other well and all that stuff. And in the second half, I thought Boston was just so much better and tighter about switching in the middle of the field and neutralizing that space for Weinberg and Jack. Talking to Charles after the game, he said it was just so tight in the second half. He's like, there were so many times where I felt like I was about to be open, but then the space would close in a moment. And he's like, every time I expected the cut that I would find in rhythm or the continuation, it just wasn't there. And we had to go so far in the backfield to find that space. And so for the Empire, I think as they're looking at the tape, again, this is just me and my brain that's not really, if you've ever played the highest level or coached at the highest level, I think the Empire got a little bit too narrow in terms of their offense in that second half. And they kind of, when things got tight, they didn't trust their width as much. And once they didn't have that width, I mean, again, that's another thing where we say, Jeff Holm and Lithio, I think Jeff Holm has done, as we mentioned last week, the best John Lithio impression that you could have expected. But John was so good because of being 6'5", was helpful too, that he wasn't afraid to get all the way to that sideline and collect the disc on that in cut all the way on the side and use the entire width of the field and then reset. Jeff isn't necessarily taking that same angle. Jeff is more comfortable handling, as we mentioned, and more comfortable coming in the backfield. But then you wind up having a very repetitive O-line where Yad is really the only one who's going to those wings and spreading the field in that way. And because even Oliver is coming into the backfield, Jeff's coming, and you're having all these players kind of doing the same thing. That once Boston started tying everything down and switching everything up, I thought they didn't even make it difficult for the Empire. But I mean, the Empire only had 11 turnovers in the whole game either. They had both O-lines held 11 of 19. They were 4 of 8 on Hucks. And again, the Empire had just 11 turnovers, which means generally you should win. But the other team had 9, and this is where I transitioned the compliment for the Boston O-line. The clock managed by Boston and their O-line that game was superb. They handled every 2-minute or less situation with poise and calm. They knew they had the big bodies to deal with both offensive and defensive situations at the buzzer, and they did. And again, they had just 9 turnovers in the game. And then when it was close late, there were 5 total goals scored in that fourth quarter. So everything got a lot tighter, and that Boston O-line just, I mean, I'm looking through the play-by-play here, and it's swing, 6-yard swing, dump, dish, pass. And those are the only words I'm seeing. And then I see a turnover here, or you see, or a huck, but the huck was 28 yards, or 32 yards, I should say.
Hey, Ryan. Have you ever thought to yourself how you could fit everything you need for one weekend into a single bag?
And there's an incredible layout block.
Oh, there's a Callahan. Mike Dross did it for New York.
From cleats to jerseys to discs, pennies, water bottles, the greatest bag can help.
And this is going to be a greatest here.
This is going to be a Callahan for Ryan Drost.
Thanks to Greatest Bag for being a sponsor of the New York Empire.
Yeah, it was a lot of very small throws, and they really did play with poise. That was the poise they were lacking when they lost. It was, content to just dump it backwards, take your time. We don't need to go anywhere with this. We can just take our time. And at times, both offenses looked a little stagnant, but they didn't force too many things. I mean, it turned into a very heavyweight fight in that fourth quarter. It was just, they had to fight for everything. Both teams weren't giving up much. And then, there were a few opportunities. Unfortunate one when Josue goes down, kind of limping, and then that free pass goes through, and the officials just let that stand. I thought that was pretty rough. You don't want to blame the game on one point, but that certainly was a big deal.
I mean, I think why that moment matters is, having talked to Josue after the game, Josue said, in other professional sports, and this is true, if a player goes down injured, it becomes if it's basketball again, it comes a 5-on-4, and you play through that. And that happens in the NFL and all these other leagues. You wait until that stoppage. I mean, soccer is a little different because it's supposed to be the game of the ship, you hit it out of bounds. But the thing is, though, the rule is that if a player goes down injured, the whistle blows and the point is stopped. And because Josue, they were in that space. They were in that space to cut off that final pass, that swing. So the pass is thrown where Josue was going to be. And again, as you mentioned, that really felt like the dagger, that point. I mean, that was the point that wound up separating. And yes, before that, when Mike had gotten the D, there are all these little moments, of course, but I don't want to. The Empire, if they had played better and gotten more turnovers and taken the disc away and scored their opportunities, they would have won the game. So it's not a blame on the refs, but the tough thing is you wind up talking about the refs, especially when a game is that physical and the margins are just so slim.
those refs also whistled so many different. There was a weird travel that was not a travel, and then there were also a few like marking violations where it just did not seem like there was that much contact. And I think the players would have played right through that, and they whistled some very weird situations. I did not think that was a very good game by the crew. But that went both ways. But just in general, the Josue one is like kind of the dagger where it stinks when you look back on it, but also would have been a good opportunity for Boston to possibly integrity that just based on the way Ultimate is played at every level of the game with in regard to injuries and like when they happen and how a play works. But again, it's 1 point. You can't be that upset about it. The other big turnover was Ethan's just throwing right into that poach block at the end of the game. I mean, that was like clear as day. I couldn't believe he threw that. That was pretty unfortunate. And then, systematically or just like from a coaching standpoint, I think I still don't love the way Empire are handling end of quarter situations. I don't feel like they're necessarily throwing out the best lines, even if they didn't necessarily get burned on it too much this game. They're also, I liked a little bit where they let the D-line play. You want them to get some reps. You want them to make Boston's O-line tired, which I think Keith was saying on the broadcast for people who watched the game.
In the third quarter, they kept it out there. But I thought, and in the early fourth too, I thought that, the first score in the fourth wasn't scored until the 7:23 mark there in the fourth quarter. So they really, that team, the D-line, they really worked them.
Like letting them play and tiring out that O-line has some value, but then once that D-line offense like stagnates on more than one possession, you got to get them out of there. That you should be trying to, win this game. Obviously, it's big. It could have playoff implications of who hosts, who's the second seed, third seed, like who travels, and again. The East is wide open now with 3 really good teams at the top. I mean, having to play one fewer game is going to be huge, whereas in the past, maybe not such a big deal. But you're looking at potentially now extra playoff game, extra road game. And I think any of these teams could beat each other. So you want to avoid that if you can, but also you play to win each game as it's in front of you. Just didn't seem like there was the right sense of urgency with the use of those timeouts. I would have absolutely put the offense back in when you're down 1 and you have a chance to tie it, instead of letting that defense kind of sputter out on a few occasions, and the stall was getting very high.
Well, that's a good transition because now it takes us to Saturday and the Empire against DC on the road in DC. And that game was always going to be huge, right? At the start of the year, you circled that game and said that's one of the most important games of the season. But now you can put it in permanent marker and circle it a ton of times, because now for the Empire to win the East Division, realistically, they need to beat DC both times, because they now split with Boston and DC also split with Boston. So if the Empire lose both against DC this season, or if they drop any other game in the division, because not every game in the division is guaranteed either. So if they drop any other games in the division, they may not host. Those are the stakes this weekend in DC. The winner of that game will likely host a playoff game. And the Empire will also then host DC in July up in at Trinity Health Stadium. So that'll be a huge game and a huge venue and a huge everything as well. So those are the stakes of this weekend. That's how big it is. And I was also going to bring up this idea that a lot of teams around the league, and especially it's very exciting. Going back to when you started, there really was no interdivisional stuff. I know you guys went to Chicago for the playoff game. I know those things happen, but with all this interdivisional stuff and teams flying and the league expanding and just being able to have marquee big games, these championship weekend preview games, if you will, throughout the regular season is awesome for the league. But you're almost seeing that backfire this year on both the Breeze and the Empire, because having lost to Atlanta, being the Empire, and then also having a really tough Salt Lake team that might be undefeated when you face them, and then the Breeze having lost their opener to Carolina, those games count the same way, because overall record matters, not divisional records. So Boston, instead of facing Carolina or Atlanta, who are, again, championship contenders in their own right, no disrespect to Montreal, but Boston has that game against Montreal instead. So, and you'd expect that Boston's going to take all 3 from Montreal, even though Montreal gave them a fight, but still, you got to take care of business. But again, on paper, it's a much easier road for Boston to win the division now because of that that game. But again, I think if you ask most of the ownership, you ask the coaches around the league, they'll say, hey, we want a challenging schedule to prepare us for the championship weekend. And if we're going to go down, we want to go down against the best. If that means that we've got to then, again, we lost to Atlanta at the start of the season, we learned so much from that opportunity. Again, so they made some big changes after the game, won that weekend. The next week did the Empire, the weekend after that. And, I think they figured some things out there. And I think a lot of teams would rather prefer that and say, we'll go on the road, we'll earn it, it's us against the world, than, avoiding a challenging schedule and opting for, maybe if we're going to play out of division teams, opting for, we'll say, the bottom half of the league in terms of the standings, or we'll add an extra division game against one of the teams that in theory is not contending for the East. And I think it brings up an interesting conversation we haven't had it before.
Yeah, the schedules are a little unbalanced just in general, which is unfortunate. And yeah, I mean, we went down to Raleigh that one time, and we had the game that went to like double overtime, and that's great. That game helps prepare you for the playoffs. You want to play as many good teams as you can. It's also more fun to play the better teams more often. I mean, no offense, sorry, Detroit. I don't imagine beating up on them by 12 goals all the time is super fun for all those other teams. I'm sure if we played Detroit a bunch of times, the Dross would also have 300 blocks each. So let
me jump in there. I'm not going to say this to Detroit. Detroit, you can come at the Dross for this. I mentioned to the Dross after the game, unfortunately, they were one home win short of tying the all-time home streak record, which was set by, as in the Empire, it ends after 6 years, 30 straight games, wins at homes. The all-time record is 31 by the Madison Radicals from 2013 to 16. And as Mike and Ryan said, okay, but let's put a Detroit-sized asterisk next to that one, because how many times did they beat up on Detroit in the early years of the league? And Detroit, though, they won more games then than they did since, again, they haven't won since 2017 at all. Yeah, a few. But so there's just Mike and Ryan just threw a little bit of water on the home record that Madison has and said, oh, I don't know, our 30 at home seems pretty impressive.
Yeah. But yeah, back to the schedules. I mean, they are a little unbalanced. It is a little unfortunate when you play a top team from another division and then it kind of dings you, and then maybe you lose out on the opportunity for the 1 seed in the home playoff game or whatever. I guess I would like to see the lower teams in each division still get at least one like cross-divisional game. Those games are fine. None of these teams are really that bad. I mean, we joke about Detroit a little bit because they have like the longest losing streak in the history of the known universe. But, I think I would watch, whatever, Portland play Houston Havoc. I'm just thinking of random teams, but I would tune into that because you don't get to see it very often. So it adds a little extra fun to it. It adds, and if you are a lower team in your division, it is often harder to get wins. So playing a lower team in another division is a good opportunity to like play kind of on par or just kind of see how the divisions stack up against each other. It's just more fun in general, overall, for everybody, the players, the teams, the fans. And then it does bring a little bit of balance to the schedule. So yeah, I would like to see more of it, and it is a little tough.
Yeah, I mean, Montreal went winless last season, but would Detroit have beaten Montreal last season? Or would Montreal have gotten their 1 win last season against Detroit? Yeah, I mean, we don't know, but to your point, those are the variables that we're not sure about. And then I said, at the top of the division, this is the big one here. I'll give you the final point and final message here, because I watched the Boston DC game as well, and
Same.
It felt like DC was kind of like the Empire. I mean, Boston won by 1, and it felt like in a very similar fashion that when Kevin Healy gets that halftime, he goes up and ties it for halftime. It just, the margin was 1 instead of 2 as it was for the Empire. But yeah, that game was super close. And I think Boston, they really were able to use the same thing against DC that they use against New York, which is, hey, we know you want to come through the middle. We know that you want to, stretch the field with break throws and then wait for your opportunities to go deep. You're not going to do it often. You want to grind this game to a halt offensively, the same way our offense is trying to do. And they were able to basically employ the same defensive sets that they did against New York, and it worked against DC as well. So I'm really interested to see both the Empire. Obviously, they're not the same overwhelming force that they were last season, but DC has also not looked as good as they did last year as well. And I think again, without Boxley, which is a huge, it's hard to understate how big that is, because even though their offense has similar numbers in terms of production, again, that the skill and talent, because Elliot Bonet has done a reasonable job in terms of numbers and production as a rookie, but yet you go down the list of the players that are missing now with Troy Holland, and it just, the bodies wind up it winds up just becoming more and more quantified that Isaac Lee is really showing out, and you're really excited about that. But again, just losing some of those veterans in key spots and key moments, that's where on the margins, DC and the Empire are just not who they were last season. So I'm really interested to see between DC and the Empire. It really is 50-50 of two teams that have everything to prove after both losing to Boston for the first time in their franchise history last weekend.
Yeah, and the potentially first in the division is on the line down the road, but even so, even if you drop one somewhere else, I mean, winning this game probably gets you the home playoff game against the other seed, which they could be each other. So, I mean, it's pretty big all around. And yeah, I mean, I think both teams will play poised. It's just interesting to see how it will all kind of play out. And, both teams are good. It should be fun to watch. Boston probably could have put a little more distance between them and DC in that game. They kind of miscued on a few end of quarter situations. They didn't really float the things nicely to Jeff. I think he probably could have stolen them an extra point or two in the game. And then Boston also looked like a little panicked at the very end. I think when they realized we probably have this, and then DC clamped down and they got a little rattled at the very end. But yeah, I think all three teams are good. The game this weekend should be a lot of fun.
So again, the Empire on the road for the next 2 weeks now. DC on Saturday at 7 p.m. and then against the Phoenix on Saturday the 15th. Then it's back to Joseph Efesina Field on Friday the 21st of June to host the Toronto Rush. So yeah, the league is as good as it's ever been. And even whether we're talking about an Empire win or an Empire loss, this season has been a ton of fun, and it continues to be a ton of fun. So thanks, Matt, again for joining me. We'll talk to you guys next week to break down the DC game and to preview that game against the Phoenix. So as we always say, see you next time.